It's the canary in the coal mine. It's the thing we're obsessed about during the entire sales cycle.
Where you can start to draw lines and correlations and connections. You have enough information there to be evaluating your strategy and understanding where demand is.
Yeah.
Flip our normal practices on their heads to focus on the shows that are in high demand.
Welcome back to Leading the Way, a series designed for arts and cultural leaders, helping you focus on the strategies and actions that turn relationships into revenue. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Visit the link in the description below for more insights. This is part 2 of our conversation on demand. In this episode, we're moving from understanding demand to actively managing it, looking at revenue, dynamic pricing, pacing, and the leadership behaviors that determine whether demand is shaped intentionally or left to chance. There is an important metric that we look at alongside this scale plan called per capita revenue, and I wonder if one of you would just explain why that is a critical metric. If there was one, I would argue, in demand that's really important to measure, it would be the per capita revenue, average ticket price, yield.
Right.
Why is that such a critical metric to look at alongside demand?
I'll start by saying it's a data point that tells the story about how the patron is valuing the experience. And the experience can be a subscription experience, it can be a membership experience, but if you just take it on a show basis, the average price paid by the consumer tells you everything about the relationship between that event and the value the current base of buying consumers are putting on it. And if it's growing, that tells you something. And if it's flat or declining, it tells you something different. And so it's the canary in the coal mine. It's the thing we're obsessed about during the entire sales cycle.
Yeah, I think that's right. The nuance I might add, Stephen, to your point about the one key metric would be the trend of that number,
Right?
Yeah.
Right? The movement
Right.
of it is actually what's indicating to us levels of demand. It's whether it's rising, falling, flat, like that calculation, and making sure, again, from the nerdy maths side of things, would be to make sure you're excluding comp tickets from that calculation quite specifically, so that you can accurately reflect the average price being paid, as opposed to a more generalized, perhaps yield figure, which would just take the total revenue divided by the number of tickets that have been allocated, right? So I think these are important things to be looking at the trend within that to help us understand where demand is.
And we can also manage that trend. Demand management of our demand is also about being purposeful in how and when we are offering different prices to keep that curve going up. That is our goal. Keep that cost of sale rising as demand rises. Because when we're doing that, we're maximizing our revenue. We're also taking care that we are offering our best, most loyal patrons the better opportunity for prices early in the sales cycle. So we're not undermining our subscription message or our membership message.
It's so interesting, as I was describing. I mean, typically in the way we organize the scale plan, if sales velocity, if sales volume continues, that per cap, that yield would grow. But if we're not tracking it, we don't see what can be undermining our revenues. So if there's too deep group discounts and you don't have a collective way of understanding that, if your marketing team is throwing discounts into the market, if comps aren't being managed, it doesn't want to go into the per cap evaluation, but you sure as heck want to understand how many comps are being distributed in the context of a show. So these key metrics in this part of our sector's business, this key metric is so crucial to understanding and maximizing income.
In context to the other metrics, right? Because I think this is what you're getting to, is that looking at it in isolation may not tell you everything.
Yeah.
Looking at it in relationship to overall revenue pacing, looking at it in relationship to ticket volume, just the the proximity of those two data points and how they are moving. Either are they moving together, or is one moving up while one is flattened, or is one moving down while the other is rising. Just having two bits of information there can tell you a lot about what to look at, what to investigate, where to ask questions in what is going on within your sales pattern. It doesn't take really overly sophisticated analytics, right? As long as you've got 2 points where you can start to draw lines and correlations and connections, you have enough information there to be evaluating your strategy and understanding where demand is.
Yeah.
Often what we see when we look at this data point with clients that have a more traditionally scaled house in the ways that you described earlier, typically lower prices at the back, higher prices towards the front, is that through the sales cycle, that per capita actually starts to decline. What does that tell us about what's going on in how that house is filling and the behavior that patrons are making through their purchase?
Well, first we know that the entire map is on sale at that time, right? We have to put the whole house on sale because the lower price tickets are in the back. And so we see people sitting, we call it sitting on price points. You can see it clearly without even seeing the prices on the map. You can see people sitting in the lowest price point, in the next price point, and so forth. And the fill is really uneven. There are lots of holes. And if you were to walk into that hall and it was only sold to 50%, which is very frequently for all of our clients, it's going to feel not great. Yeah.
The other thing it tells me is that particular instance is that the lower price seats were probably the last seats to be sold, which means if they were available the entire time, most of the sales cycle has gone its way without those lowest price seats being sold in a way to influence the per cap until the very end. So the consumer is telling us how they're valuing both where the seats are and what the price is, and that in fact, the lowest price seats being the last to be sold is an indication of really high demand and actually very little price sensitivity. We had low prices available and people were not buying them. They were choosing to buy the more expensive seats before they get to the low price seats. And then they're only buying them because it's all that's left and we're in high demand. And so now we're in high demand and we have all this inventory and it's just wiping revenue off the table.
It's the reverse of what you said earlier on, is that there's no choice at the end of the sales cycle.
Right.
The choice is the lowest price.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, one of the things that we talk about regularly is that when we approach the scale plans and the management of the inventory, the pricing of the inventory in the way that we do, it can feel unfair. It can feel unfair to us that as demand grows, what happens is that only the highest prices or the second highest prices are available in the furthest away locations. But that's not static, right? That's not static. Like, our approach is to say we must manage this on a day in and day out basis, especially when something is in demand.
But it's so rare that we're there.
Right.
It's so rare that we're in the situation that we have the last 50 seats available.
Right.
So when that happens, we must be hyper-focused on managing that moment. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's what they will go for. How much can we get?
Right. And if demand starts to slow, then what? Then what do we do?
The data is going to tell us. You started with this question earlier around, can prices get too high? And they can get too high in certain parts of theaters at certain levels of demand. Yes, the data will show us, not always our feeling about fairness, right? That may be the thing we want to acknowledge and set aside for a moment and spend our time really studying the data to say, as we're getting to that point, we have fewer price points available. They tend to be at the higher end of the price scale. Are we watching volume and velocity closely enough to sense out if prices are getting too high for where we are, both in the sales cycle and in the venue?
And then what do we do?
Then we can react.
Right.
And then we can react by rescaling, by adding some inventory at some prices perhaps closer to your target per capita revenue, or what will ensure you to at least prevent the per capita revenue from starting to fall. The only thing we're trying to prevent there is when you're in your highest levels of demand, the per capita revenue falling off a cliff. If we can continue to drive volume and at least maintain the per capita revenue for where we are at that moment,
That's
good. That is excellent demand
Managing
management.
demand.
Yes.
And I think this leads nicely to the final element of managing demand, which is dynamic pricing, which often is easily framed as prices going up. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It can mean prices can come down.
No, otherwise we just call it price increases, right? It's called dynamic prices because it just means change. Right. Dynamic just means that it changes, right?
So there is increasingly automation around dynamic pricing. There is still a lot of debate about dynamic pricing and the transparency of that. We do believe it has a role to play, but that these other 2 points, perception of success and the scale plan, are really important to get foundationally right first. When is dynamic pricing okay to do? Should I have that available on every performance? If I'm using software, should it be everywhere all the time? Should they go up and down? So many questions.
Many
Settle
questions.
the dynamic pricing debate.
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said dynamic pricing is. You didn't say it this way. Dynamic pricing is like the cherry on top. If we're exactly. If we're scaling a venue appropriately, managing demand and per capita revenue, really that is where the lion's share of the positive revenue perception and behavioral impact happens. Boy, oh boy, our clients have been doing dynamic pricing up and down for decades, manually. And now it's possible to do all the time because software, it makes it algorithmically possible to see what the right answers are.
There are a lot of things out there that are good ideas, poorly executed. And I think this is where dynamic pricing, I think this is the category dynamic pricing has fallen into in our sector. It is a good idea in terms of maximizing revenue, but when poorly executed, it ends up getting the headlines and it has the experience and gets the tarnish on it that so many feel. And so I think it's important to separate out the difference between the concept and the execution. It's the execution of it that leads to the upset and the tension with customers. Our practice has been to implement dynamic pricing little and often. Incremental, small steps, but quite often. Not doing it in large chunks, rarely doing it very early in the sales cycle because we want to encourage people to continue to buy early. We want to hold the price selection and the price choice early in the sales cycle as close to our original intent as possible so that we have that motivating factor to drive behavior earlier in the sales cycle. But when we're getting later in the sales cycle and as demand is increasing or as we're needing to respond to particular data points, little and often increments often create less risk around either reputational risk or financial risk that may come from dynamic pricing, which means if it's little and often, it can come on anything. It could be on any show, on nearly any seat, maybe not your entry-level price seats that you would want to hold on to. That price is from language to be consistent, that there's some inventory not subject to dynamic pricing, but it doesn't have to only come on sellouts. You can still have that show we were talking about that is only going to sell to 40% capacity. You may actually find price is not a barrier to that show. You don't have enough inventory at the top price for that show. You just don't have enough volume compared to other shows, in which case price isn't an issue, just volume. The customers you have for that show are not price sensitive, so there's an opportunity to maximize the revenue even when we're in lower or mixed demand. And this is a really important element of managing demand overall and thinking about revenue when we're in lower demand. Dynamic pricing is not just a benefit for your sellout shows. It can have an impact on adding incremental revenue to low and mixed demand shows.
It's a really cool shift in the sector, that reality, and goes back to the relationship conversation we were having with loyalists in a venue, attracted to a performance experience that's distinct and valuable to them. Technology now enables us to see, and our practices enable us to be open to incremental growth in that price that they will pay.
So software is playing an increasing role in how we manage demand, and yet the trust of allowing software to make big decisions on our behalf, that's hard for us to do. And as a sector, we are relatively slow on adoption of technology. AI is going to have an increasing impact here. How do we lean into that tension a bit more to have the impact that software can have?
Yeah, I think organizations, it hasn't been so long that many of us can still remember when we were not selling tickets online and how terrified we were of selling tickets online and how long it took for some organizations to really embrace that, what has now become 70, 80% of all ticket sales have come through this particular channel. And it has created huge improvements in terms of data and sales expediency and customer information that we're getting. So there's been these knock-on effects that have been really positive, and yet we maybe dragged our feet a little bit as a sector. So we have an opportunity to perhaps learn from that when we're talking about this next iteration of software impacts on our core business, in particular to help us with both pricing, so in terms of dynamic pricing, and in terms of inventory management. And the case that I would make to organizations would be that this, again, is another opportunity to let the humans in your box office do what humans do best, which is to advance relationships and to be in communication with the humans who are buying your tickets, and let software do what software does best, which is to be much more efficient and much more quick and smart about understanding sales trends, understanding demand, and where we may be able to make incremental pricing adjustments. We can optimize the people if we've got the tools. If we can get the people out of where we should have tools, those people can now be deployed to advance the most important thing, which is the relationships we have with our patrons.
Yeah. And this is critical. We've decided to partner with a company, Dynamo, that helps automate dynamic pricing, up and down dynamic, to your point. How are we seeing that impact teams in the decisions that they're making, and most importantly, the time that it's freeing up to do some of the things that you're describing?
I think the biggest shift is it's expanding the palette of product that we are able to direct dynamic pricing attention to.
Right.
So when we're in purely manual work around implementing dynamic pricing, because of its manual requirements and because of the time it can take when it's manual, organizations have often only prioritized implementing dynamic pricing in the absolute highest demand shows, which, as we've talked about, is a relatively thin slice of our kind of demand portfolio, so to speak. What working with companies like Dynamo has allowed our clients to do is expand that portfolio. So a lot more work, a lot more product can start to have the attention that's required to understand where there are opportunities to raise and lower prices in order to optimize sales volume. That has freed up time within the staff who used to spend lots of time, not just managing price, but managing inventory. There's an element to Dynamo's work that makes it somewhat unique in the landscape of software doing this, which is providing tools that allow clients to understand when we might need to release more inventory. Are we getting close to a point on an instance by instance level where we might need to have more tickets and more seats on sale? That was also very time consuming when it's done at a manual level, and oftentimes meant that maybe we weren't putting quite as enough attention to some product, and maybe we're releasing more seats earlier than we should or more than we needed because that was just easier to do, to get out in front of it. But that creates the fill pattern problems that kind of undermine what the scaling work is.
I think it's really important to remember here, though, that we jump to dynamic pricing being the full solution, but it's like we talk about it like a three-legged stool, those three elements. It's still critical to have that foundational part of dynamic pricing is not going to resolve perception of success. Dynamic pricing will maximize your revenue, but only if the right number of price points are available and the original scale plan is configured to your data. And often I think that's the mismatch, right? Because we don't want to have too many seats in the top price band because we think that only these seats could be that price, but the demand for them often higher. So I want folks to hear that it is the demand management is a full strategy and not just dynamic pricing being a bolt on to perhaps something that might still need optimizing.
I think you're right. I think it's about understanding demand management, again, goes back to the very beginning. This is not just about price. And oftentimes, if we talk about the tools within demand management, by just jumping to software that focuses on dynamic pricing, yes, that helps with dynamic pricing. But to your point, that's only one leg of the stool. And so when you're evaluating software, or you're looking at how you might be able to leverage the power of software to enhance that entire demand management strategy, looking at things that touch more of that work would be better, right? And so not all software options touch on all these other elements, but that regardless of what you choose, that foundational work of the right scale plan, the right number of seats in the right price points with the right inventory release plan, all of that has to be, that's what has to be embedded before you can get the kinds of gains that we're seeing some clients are having by leveraging software on top of that. You can't start with software without having the strong underpinning. You're not going to see the results.
And my observation is that with this particular partner, Dynamo, this isn't just set it and forget it software. There's an ability as an administrator to both set controls and to be able to see what the impact is of this dynamic pricing software process on your business before you just commit fully to letting the software drive.
There's lots of guardrails in place and lots of nuance that can be done to think about how you're even applying software differently from a product to product basis, and the quality of the data that you're getting out of the reports to let you know what is working and what's not working. That's a huge part of the impact of software. Even clients before who were implementing dynamic pricing struggled to be able to quantify its benefits.
Right.
To actually measure it. I think they knew instinctively deep down, our per caps are rising and we're generating more revenue. I can't actually pinpoint and measure how much of that is being driven by dynamic pricing. Software is now able to help you do that. So you can measure where you are making the right decisions and where you could possibly lean in more. You'll have the data behind you to help.
Yeah.
There's still a really important human element here too. There's a lot of nuance here, and management is not set and forget. It requires people to get together and talk about these things. So what is the best structure, and who should be around the table to talk about things like perception of success, to monitor and manage the per capita revenue, to make decisions around dynamic pricing? Is that something that the box office manager should focus on in isolation? Who should be involved in managing demand?
It's really a group effort. It should be something that everyone who touches patrons in your organization should be part of and aware of, and looking at that data and practicing. And that goes from the executive level all the way through the organization. So yes, we should all be looking at that data. We should be looking at who we're inviting and when, and how we're using price to motivate behavior and build relationships. And when we are able to take advantage of demand, how we are doing so in order to help us further our mission and fund the cool and do all of those sort of those programs that are really dear to our hearts and to why we do what we do.
This concept of, we call them revenue pacing meetings. It's sort of the how of managing demand. But I think sometimes we forget, and with every bit of authentic respect for box office staff that we have, we outsource the management of these decisions to a person or a department. When in fact, this is the business we're in. Like, everybody is in the business of how do people get access to these seats, when, at what price. And so some time ago, we just threw down the gauntlet and said, rather than getting together to talk about our to-do lists, what if we got together to talk about how we're managing our business? And so, Christina, I think you're right. The executive, chief exec, the marketing development, they have access to sponsor tickets and other kinds of seating benefits. Certainly the box office, group sales. It sounds overdone, but it is the way in which the business can be more effectively managed.
And your relationships. I mean, we're not a big fan of silos. Right. So we're not a big fan of having meetings that are only going to involve one particular department at a time, especially when that meeting is about how we are managing the relationships we have with the patrons and the customers that we serve. Inevitably, that ticket transaction is still related to a development transaction, related to the messaging and the marketing communications that are going to wrap around that, and for a leadership's understanding of what is driving and influencing the business. So yeah, a cross-departmental, regular, brief, well-agended, well-executed, right? Every single week to understand where are we managing inventory, where are we managing price, where are we managing campaign. Those are kind of the key elements of these revenue pacing meetings that are going to help people efficiently and not only move through decisions, but disseminate what is happening in this narrative around demand and revenue across the team.
Do you know what else it does? The evergreen argument, is it programming's fault or marketing's fault that something didn't work?
Right.
And when we are regularly managing our business together, we see what's happening. And when we can also make decisions that if something is in demand, we're going to put more money against that and invest more. And together decide if something is not meeting our expectations. Well, what are we going to do? Not marketing director, how are you going to solve this? But what are we going to do and how are we going to shift the way that we're allocating our time and resources?
And we've got to, even when we introduce revenue pacing meetings, we've got to break the learned behavior that we start with the things that aren't selling. We just do it. We've trained ourselves to obsess about that. And in fact, to your point about funding the call, if we can invest a bit more here, it will enable us to run the associated campaigns to focus on audience development and growth in those places where there is lower demand. It's just super interesting that even with this structure, the place we go to is where things aren't selling.
Yes, and by looking at data regularly, we flip from activity-based marketing meetings. Oh, we did this, we're going to do this, and sort of we're done with that now. And then we wonder why sales aren't happening. It allows us to see what's working, where we should devote our time, where we have opportunity and high demand to earn more revenue, where we have shows that are going to house our loyal patrons and we want to maximize the experience, but we might not pour money into it because it's just not working.
It's remarkable to me, actually, as we're talking about this, the percentage of shows that go sold clean out. It's low. And how often we say, that's selling well. Let's divert our energy to the thing that isn't selling well. When in fact, if there's open seating, it's our obligation to invest in it. It's really interesting, the paradigm shift.
The lost revenue is really not insignificant in those. That last 15%, when your per cap is higher, you're in high demand, your marketing dollars and pounds generate a great return, and we turn the tap off.
And your team's time. I know I've been a bit of a broken record about the opportunity costs within our teams, but our teams are stretched. Every hour of their day has got to be optimized on what is going to drive the most revenue and impact to the organization. And when we start over-investing not just our money, but our time on shows that are not meeting expectation, that is reducing the ROI on our team. It's diminishing their morale and their feeling of success because there just may not be the levers in place to turn that show around, whereas every additional ticket you would sell over here on a show that is not yet sold out but is exceeding expectations has a bigger net impact to the organization. This is such an important element to how we think about all of our resource, not just where we're spending our marketing funds, also where are we steering and encouraging our team to spend their time. It's a huge resource. Every team feels strapped and having to make difficult decisions every week about what I can get done and what I can't get done. These kinds of decisions and allowing teams to let the foot off the gas on some things so that we can optimize time and energy over here is a really important paradigm shift to make the most of the resources we have.
Absolutely. And it allows us to actually feel like we're doing something and accomplishing something and feel good about what we're doing. And a lot of times, if we're not looking at it in this way, you can see the faces around the table. We just feel like we can't get it all done and we're not having an impact. And with this kind of discipline, this kind of strategy, we can turn the table.
If our scale plans are shaped with this in mind, if we have back to the very beginning around where are we optimizing experience versus where are we optimizing revenue, if we're in lower demand than we are expected, but we have a solid inventory management plan in place, we can still create a perception of success, that show is not a failure. It may not have met its budget target, and that needs to be assessed, right, at a different time when we're going back and looking at projections. But in the near term, could we overperform here to balance that out? But those audience members are still going to have a good experience, even if that's not meeting our own internal sales expectations. So to remember to put them at the center, not just our own desire. And sometimes it's just an instinct that this show should be selling better. It should be more full. And when it's not, we feel like something's wrong with the audience. Whereas instead of thinking about the audience that is there and ensuring that their experience is excellent, while I'm shifting my marketing and sales effort to something that has a better return.
Fundamental.
So if I want to take one step to managing demand in my organization, what should I do tomorrow?
As a leader, I think I would be interested in understanding for my low demand shows. I would ask my team to show me the footprint of audience seating in a low demand scenario and see how that feels and looks. Am I satisfied with that look in my venue?
Yeah, I would start including this per capita revenue tracking with your other sales tracking and just bring some awareness to the trends that you're seeing in per capita revenue. What happens when you're in lower demand? What happens when you're in higher demand? What's happening early in the sales cycle versus later in the sales cycle? Just start to bring some awareness to this particular metric and how it is moving through relationship to other metrics and where you are in the sales pattern.
Yeah.
And I would add to that I would flip our normal practices on their heads to focus on the shows that are in high demand. As you said before, oftentimes we look at the things that aren't selling and we try to figure out how we can get them to sell. Take some of that time, really focus on the shows that are in demand and maximize your revenue for those shows first. It's like an oxygen mask on an airplane. Put your oxygen mask on, infuse those high demand shows with revenue generating opportunities, and then you can sustain and support the others.
Thank you. Jill, Brad, Christina, thank you for talking about demand. Now that you've heard this episode's takeaways, think about one action you can take this week to actively manage demand and drive stronger revenue and relationships. For more insights and resources, visit the link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon for the next episode of Leading the Way.